Jerry Hyde, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you. That's a good title.
Yeah, thank you. I rather am in love with it myself. It felt to me a clever play on words, and so I've stuck with it. And other people have even stolen it. And I found that there's no recourse. There's no way I can deal with them to get them to stop when they do things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting coincidence. I thought about it as a title for a book and not used it, but I might do one day. But if I do, I'll credit you.
Okay, great. I'll appreciate that. Well, yesterday I was listening to the final podcast, your final podcast of the year. And I believe it's titled It's Not You, It's Me. Is that right?
Yeah.
I got that right?
Yeah, that was about a year ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah, I stopped doing my show about a year ago now.
Okay.
So I appreciate how much work you guys put into it. Those of you that keep.
Yeah, well, you put a lot into it, and I love the closing interview, which was a collection of snippets of other interviews that you had, and all seemed very, just little short things, all intriguing and fascinating people that you have who have been in your orbit or you've been in their orbit, and so you share really great stuff, and there's a lot of intimacy in it, and I would love if we can bring any of that into this conversation here, although I have this false sense of knowing you, having listened to some of your podcasts and having read your book, which I have to say I really got hooked by your book. It kind of grabbed me by the throat and wouldn't let me go. Nice. I see you smiling. That's, you don't mind that.
No, it's you never know when you write a book who's gonna like it and who isn't, and who it's gonna reach, or if it's gonna reach anyone at all. But that's always great to hear. Right.
The fact is that just about everybody that I interview these days has written a book, and the other fact is I'm visually challenged and really have difficulty reading, but I read your whole bloody book all the way, every word. So that's what I mean when I say it really grabbed me. And so that's about the highest tribute I can pay you is how effective it was on me, how it impacted me. And I love reading about it's kind of like an adventure. At least the first few chapters, maybe more, are like going along with you on your adventures in exciting locations like Tangier and Nepal and France, and the characters that you meet, the adventures that you're having, both inner and outer adventures. So there's my endorsement for your book. And I hope all that I'm selling it to my listeners and viewers.
I'm a therapist, and I'm not a great reader. I'm dyslexic. I can't even read my own stuff very well. I forget what I've written half the time.
Oh yeah.
But I think because my attention is pretty limited these days, maybe that's a global phenomenon, as we're all kind of more used to screens than books. Yeah, I do my best to make this book short, because I don't think people want hugely long books like we used to. And also I think to make it a bit, to put some humor in. I don't think self-help books have to be dry and serious all the time. To put some humor, or like you say, to put a bit of adventure in there, to try and make it readable, and then throw hopefully some useful tips in there as well.
Yeah. Well, you succeeded in that as far as I'm concerned. I would like to, after all this, I'm looking at my notes here. In the introductory chapter, you confess that it was very hard for you to write. Now, I know you've written other books, but I haven't read those other books. What was it about this particular book that was challenging you and making it hard to write?
I think I went deeper into my own personal history, perhaps than I've done in other books.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and it got pretty shady. I got into some of my own shadow work, and my girlfriend at one point was like, "Are you sure you want to publish this?" But my only filter these days is my kids. I think there's always that sense of what do I want to share with them. I'm pretty transparent with everyone, but when you get into the sexual stuff, yeah, I think that was my only filter. But even that, I feel
yeah.
pretty
Even
good.
that you didn't pull back too much.
No, no, not at all. But it's challenging. It's challenging to go into the darker sides of our sexuality. I think as men, particularly, we kind of have a responsibility to do that. Perhaps now more than ever. But
Yeah,
it's kind of scary going into those labyrinths. Because what are you going to find in there?
right, right, definitely.
Yeah.
Um, well, I'd like my audience to get a sense of the writing that I'm raving about here. And so I would like you to read a few pages from your book, starting at page 4, with a line that says, "The last 75 years."
Well, that'll make me sweat. That's like the first time, probably since about 1979, that I've been asked to read out loud. when I
Ah,
do
okay.
when I when I do book launches, I always get actors to do it, but it's a good challenge. So let me have a go.
Okay, and
So
just so you know, I want you to start with that line and
yeah,
read through uh, to I think it's at the top of page 6.
yeah, evolution.
Uh, no objective other than.
Yeah, cool. Let me give it a shot. So
Great.
the last 75 years has been sold to us as the space age, an era of ease, an instant plastic era of simplicity, efficiency, automation, and abundance. And we've all been complicit in gobbling up this smorgasbord of consumerist delights. And now we're paying the price for the post-World War II era as the post-World War II era collapses before our frenzied eyes like a cold deck of cards. As with everything, however, it's not all bad. Within this biblical landscape of plague, mass confinement, brutality, death, fire, pestilence, oppression, deception, corruption, white
Yes.
supremacy, riots, dictators, and toppled statues is an opportunity for real change. At the time of writing, I've been a therapist for 25 years, and at no point has anyone ever walked into my practice room and said, "Actually, you know what? I feel fantastic. I'm on top of the world." No, they come in when they're heartbroken, destroyed, on their knees, lost, abandoned, alone, in unbearable pain. We as a species are complacent motherfuckers. It's only when we're hurting that we tend to evolve. And right now, the world is really hurting. This book has itself been painful, the hardest of anything I've ever written. It twisted and turned and refused to be pinned down or contained like some kind of wild Comanche cult. And it dragged me around the prairie, clinging onto its back and often falling off, refusing to be tamed. Of course, we are fools if we imagine that it is us that write books. We don't. They use us like incubi. They are demons, and we the portal through which they arrive in their own damn good time, bursting forth from our chests when we least expect it. It took me to places I never imagined. It broke me and changed me profoundly. I hope it does the same for you. And by break, I mean to shatter the calcified crust of your outdated persona to get to the hidden parts of your being so that you can thrive and grow. I've been called, perhaps jokingly, perhaps not, the most dangerous therapist in the world. And as such, I've worked with an incredibly diverse crowd of people over the years: mercenaries, murderers, murder victims, psychopaths, musicians, artists, rapists, rape victims, pedophiles, rock stars, actors, authors, celebrities, suicides, high achievers, abject failures, sex addicts, drug addicts, porn addicts, shopaholics, workaholics, alcoholics, psychedelic explorers, wife beaters, shoe sniffers, and piss club aficionados. And I'm the only therapist I ever heard of who worked with a ventriloquist and his dummy. I've done marriage guidance, sex therapy, anger management, violence prevention, creativity coaching. I've buried people alive. I've given them class A narcotics, allegedly. Starved people for days, kept them awake for weeks at a time. But none of this is what makes me the most dangerous therapist in the world. What makes me and any half-decent therapist dangerous is my understanding that true transformation is a process of death and rebirth, death and rebirth, death and rebirth, a constant, never-ending cycle of destruction and creation, shattering and rebuilding, chaos and order with no objective other than to constantly be in a state of evolution.
Thank you. It's great to hear you read that.
Oh,
and it reminds me of one of the things that, to reinforce this, one of the things that one of your guests in that final podcast said, describing your flat, your apartment where you live. If you still live there, I don't know, but
I do.
And it's got a couple signs that people encounter when they come in. I think you live there, and it's also the place when you're seeing people in person. I don't know if you've been seeing people in person during the pandemic or not. You have.
On and off. On and off.
On and off.
When we're allowed to.
So what are these signs that people, as the person in the podcast described, going along this long hallway of wafting smoke coming, marijuana smoke coming from all the adjacent apartments? It was a vivid description. And the signs, tell us about the signs.
I got different, I painted one wall. I live in an old factory. So yeah, it's full of boho types with a lot of weed smoking going on. I live in a kind of quite a colorful part of London anyway. And I painted one wall of this factory building with blackboard paint. And when my kids were young, actually, I just wanted to encourage them to write on the wall. But then I kind of started writing quotes that meant something to me. And so there's various ones. I think one of my favorite ones I can see out of the corner of my eye is by Carl Jung. And he said, "Do you want to be good or whole?" And I think that's a fantastic challenge when we're looking at shadow work, because that's it really does come down to that. Do you want to be one of the good guys, one of the nice guys, someone who's seen as, safe and predictable and reasonable and safe, or do you want to be a whole human being? And if you're going to be a whole human being, that doesn't mean you have to act out your shadow side, but you need to accept it and know it.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge. Actually, the signs that I remember was that one initially encountered at the door, fuck off.
Just says fuck off.
Yeah. And then the next one was abandon hope, all ye who enter here. The quote from Dante, the Inferno. So you're really giving people a heads up. Okay, you're in for something here.
The Dante one, the fuck off one is that's my dark sense of humor, or silly, infantile sense of humor, whichever way you want to look at it. It just seems so wrong for a psychotherapist to have that as their doormat. So I couldn't resist. And the Dante one is a little bit more serious, or has more meaning to me, in that I think that a lot of people, well, myself particularly, but a lot of people that I work with, they first come into therapy, they're looking for a cure, they're looking for a magic pill, they're looking for something that's going to make their life okay, or the pain to go away. And firstly, that's not going to happen. But secondly, and most importantly, there's a payoff to abandoning the hope that you're ever going to be fixed or rescued, right? That I think there's a deep, quite primal longing that we have for our parents to finally show up and be the parents we wanted in some shape or form. I think a lot of people, whether they're conscious of that or not, hold that hope that it may be their parents, it may be someone else is going to rescue them. And the fact is that's not going to happen. And when you let go of that hope, there may well be a period of grieving or mourning or sadness that you have to go through, but there's an amazing payoff, which is called becoming an adult. And when you really become an adult, which is, okay, I'm in this life, I've been given this life, and I have to take responsibility for my own experience and how I impact the people around me and my environment. When you really face up to that, I think the experience I had is this rather amorphous kind of new age therapy term that I never understood. Stepping into your power. Well, okay, we've heard that expression quite a lot, probably most of us. But what does it really mean? For me, it means being an adult, and I come from quite a rock and roll background where, with my doormat, it's a hint that there's still a degree of petulance or rebellion in me. And the idea of growing up, I had that kind of Mick Jagger, Peter Pan thing of, oh, growing up is for squares or it's really boring. And, my
Right,
job is
right. I can identify
to,
with that.
stick it to the
Yeah.
man. But I don't think I don't think being an adult, being grown up means you got to give up anything. I think you can hold on to your childlike wonder and spontaneity and creativity, but you also take responsibility for defining yourself and your life choices. And that's an incredibly empowering state to live in. And I think it's a weird one because I look around the world and I don't see that many people who have really become embodied adult human beings, because I think through no fault of their own, I think we've lost touch with a lot of the rites of passage, the puberty
Mm.
rites and rituals that traditionally we've had over the millennia, that gave a child a sense of moving into adulthood. And for most people in our culture, that I suppose you have in Jewish culture, you have bar mitzvahs, but I struggle to think of what else there is for most people where you get a sense of, okay, I've been given this gift of maturity. And I look around the world at people in power. I think power is an incredibly difficult thing to manage for most people. One of the most common accusations or observations that get made of politicians, particularly our current prime minister in the UK and your former president in America, is the accusation, well, they behave like children. Donald Trump, he's
Yeah.
behaving like a child. He's not behaving like a child. He is a child. And I think
Mhm.
when you accept he's a very, very, broken, stunted human being, and
Right.
Boris Johnson's been through that British public school system that I went through, that creates a certain kind of person that has a structure and a form where they appear capable, but the inner world isn't necessarily matured. So yeah, they behave like kids. They lie, they cheat, they grab pussy, they do whatever they want. And it's a kind of belligerent toddler state that a lot of people in adult shaped bodies get up to. And it's not a given that any of us become adult. I didn't get close till I was in my early 50s.
Yeah, and I think part of what grabbed me in the book actually was a lot of your prolonged adolescence, really, that you were the kind of adolescence venturing and adventuring into the world really resonated with me because I have a strong element of that in my own personality. And so I could really identify with that. I want to come back to the writing style in this book. How would you describe it?
I was approached by my partner's French, so I spent a lot of time in France, and I was approached by quite a prestigious publisher there who said, "Oh, I read on Amazon, you can get a few pages free." So I guess he'd read the first few pages of the book. He's like, "I really want to publish your book." So I sent him a copy, and then he messaged me about a week later and went, "I can't publish your book." it's like this is like 10 books in one book. And part of me was disappointed. I wouldn't deny that, but also part of me went, well, thank fuck a kind of mainstream publisher didn't want to publish my book, because if they did, I'd have probably got it wrong. But I'm not writing in a deliberately unconventional way. I've got a certain amount of, like a lot of people these days, attention deficit. I'm dyslexic. I'm probably a bit autistic. My mind is all over the place, and that's how I write. It is quite stream of consciousness is probably the kindest thing you could say about it. And that works for a certain kind of person. And it isn't going to work for someone who wants that kind of classic narrative arc. I don't know. I'm shit at that.
Right.
I'm really bad at that. I'm not going to pretend that I can do that with any great skill. I think that
I describe the writing as muscular, somehow masculine and muscular. that was the image that came to mind. And you pay a certain amount of homage to people like Hunter Thompson, who unfortunately I never read, William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, maybe Jack Kerouac. What draws you to these guys?
Yeah, I guess I'm resonating, I mean, I wouldn't even begin to compare myself, but in their work, there is, Burroughs used a lot of cut up where he would write a passage and then literally take scissors and cut the paper up and stick the words back down again. And I'll do a certain amount of that because you kind of bypass the linear way that your brain works, and you start to come up with random words and phrases that actually have their own meaning. And I find that very exciting.
Yeah.
To try and get away from being super rational and come up with, I suppose it's like painting pictures with words.
Yeah.
For me, when I'm in that zone, when I write well, it feels more like dancing. I described it to someone recently as, I write from my hips, from my pelvis, and there's something in the fluidity and the rule breaking nature of those guys that I think really appeals to me. I saw Kerouac's manuscript in Paris a few years ago for On the Road, and it's on one continuous roll of paper. It's about 100 meters.
Wow.
And you can see and I think in the opening pages of On the Road, I think it's in On the Road, he talks about you have to write with the kind of drive of a benzodrine addict, a kind of speed freak, and you can see that in the manuscript that he's just kind of pumped it out. And I like to write like that, with almost trying to transcend my mind and see what my fingers do.
I was very influenced by On the Road as a college student. And Buddy and I, we started hopping freight trains as a result of reading that. We're in college, but we're hopping freight trains and having some pretty serious adventures. In your bio, you say that you have run one of the largest, maybe the largest men's group in the UK, and I've been in a men's group for 30 or 40 years. I've lost track.
Wow.
But and a lot of the book, you really are writing about your own dance with masculinity, your journey, your dance with masculinity. Let's rhapsodize about that a little bit.
I mean, just to touch on the largest men's group thing, it sounds like a big kind of boast. It's very un-English to boast. It's bittersweet, that statement, because that amounts to about 35 people.
Okay.
And that's the biggest, and that's catastrophic to me. That shouldn't be the biggest. That should be what it is, which is a tiny drop in the ocean. But I think that when I spend time in Paris, they have no men's groups, or it's very, very much in its infancy. I get a lot of people talking to me about it because they just don't know what we're doing. I feel that France is kind of behind us in that sense, and they're still very, very interested in psychoanalysis, and it's quite heady.
Yeah.
The UK, I think, are kind of trailing behind the US as I see it, and the US are the pioneers for me. And I know a lot of the men's work came out of the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and even you could say, the Hells Angels is something that Hunter S. Thompson made me aware of, that the Hells Angels came out of GIs coming back from the Second World War and wanting to stay with their squads, so they formed biker gangs. So I would say that's a kind of infant men's group movement, pretty free and loose. So that's just to put that in that context, that I have a pitifully small men's group practice, but it is probably the biggest in the UK, or one of the biggest. The masculinity flavor is interesting. I'm a little bit blind to it. I mean, I do go blind to my work, because you kind of get snowblind when you become immersed in a book. But I have to say, I wrote that book 5, 6, maybe 7 times, and kept junking it and then going back and starting again and rewriting it. And my initial notion was that I would write a book about masculinity. And the more I got into that, the more I have to say I'm not very interested in gender or masculinity, and a lot of people are surprised by that because I run men's groups and they think we must sit around talking about what it means to be a man all the time. We don't do that at all. I run men's groups for many reasons. I also run mixed groups, but primarily men's groups. They're single sex because what I've observed is if you bring a woman into the room, the men will get triggered unconsciously into all their defense mechanisms of what they've learned from society not to be in front of a woman, get triggered. Now, if you want to work with that, then that's a useful thing to do. But I prefer to be able to bypass that. So that's what we're doing, but we're not asking these kind of profound questions around gender. We're just trying to be better human beings. So when I tried to write a book that was very gender based, I thought, well, this doesn't really interest me. I know there's a lot of people would like me to write that book because of my experience, but unless I'm interested, I don't have the drive to. I can only drive from a place. I can only write from a place of passion. And I'm not particularly passionate about men's work or the men's movement. I'm passionate about the guys that I work with and that I know, but they're my tribe, and that's why I veered more into some of the stuff around, the anthropological stuff around our tribal origins, which my friend Sebastian Junger does far better. His book Tribe is, just give a shout out to that. It's an amazing book if you haven't read it.
I have not read that book. I've seen it referred to. I read his one of the war books that he wrote about these guys who, it's been a long time since I read it, but these guys who are stranded in somewhere in Afghanistan or someplace like that, right?
Yeah, the Korangal Valley.
Yeah, and so that was powerful, and I think a film was made by that about that as well. So, in my own, what I sense in you and something that I suspect we have in common, the men that I have been most close to, I guess there is a feminine quality. Some people would, in the sense of being open to sharing and sharing vulnerability and talking about the uncertain places and fear and so on. So I've always been drawn to that kind of guy. At the same time, though, I think you and I both have done some pretty crazy things, kind of potentially life-threatening things. And I wonder if what I think I have understood for myself about that, and I wonder if it's true for you. And this is a fairly recent insight, really. I hope I can still remember it to articulate it here. I guess my defenses are clicking in or something here that it's hard for me to articulate. But I think the thing about staring death in the face and doing things that are dangerous is something about wanting to, as you say, we don't have the rituals of transition. And so one is actually facing danger. And since our culture doesn't provide us with it necessarily, as adolescents, we go out and we seek it and create it in various ways. And so I think for me, a lot, it was about wanting to measure up, wanting to be able to hang with men's men. I've had a couple of friends or one friend in particular, who I just think of as a man's man, because he went all the way from being a poet to building several of the houses that he lived in and other things like that. Fantastic musician, etc. So that's me kind of riffing on this. Do you?
Yeah, there's a lot of knife crime in the UK and a lot of knife crime in the area that I live in. My guess is that at least part of what's behind that is it's a rite of passage. You know, you go out and prove yourself by stabbing someone. You know,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
there's such a phenomena of absent fathers who aren't around to contain these kids and give them guidance and steer them through. That yeah, that proximity to death and even bringing about death, I think, is something that a lot of kids will turn to. No, that was one of the I think I wrote about it in the book when I took the West African plant medicine called iboga, and that was, you know, I went into that full of all sorts of hopes and expectations that I was going to go on this 36-hour trip and be taken back through time and blah blah blah, and none of that happened at all. I was just told, stop doing this kind of shit, stop, you got nothing to prove here. You know, this is the wrong reason to be doing extreme plant medicines, is because I think I was doing, there was part of me that was doing it to prove that I could. uh
yes.
you know, it's better than stabbing someone, but it wasn't, you know, in its essence it was still from that place of trying to prove to my father or the world that I was a man.
Yeah. I also, the missing father has been a theme in my life. And
Mm.
as I look back, see a lot of things that see where that was a kind of an organizing principle. There's actually another passage that I'd like to have you read from your book that's quite relevant
Okay.
here, I think. The book's divided
You want me
into
to?
three sections, which you've labeled sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So right now, this
Yeah.
is a little bit about drugs.
Which page is it on?
Yeah, this is, now I have to find it. I have it written down here. It's also from the introduction. Um, it's about taking a sort of DMT type drug.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the very beginning of the book, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not finding the quote of where I wanted you to start and stop. But I think it does start from page 1.
Mm.
And yeah, so I know it's in here somewhere, just not seeing it right now. But let's have you read from page 1 for maybe a couple of
Okay.
pages.
Okay. Have you ever been in one of those Tesla sports cars? They have two acceleration modes, sport or insane. If you're foolhardy enough to press option 2, and let's face it, who isn't, you'll be propelled from 0 to 60 in just over 3 seconds. When smoked, the venom from the Sonoran desert toad has a similar effect. Within moments of inhalation, you're rushing like a bastard through a blizzard of fractals that usher in a near-death experience as very quickly you come to the understanding that, like it or not, you're going in to the light. First time, it took me a while before I realized the person on the other side of the room groaning like they were dying from a serious head wound was me. A great many people report that when under the influence of 5-MeO-DMT, for this is the active ingredient of the dried venom, which is widely considered the most powerful psychedelic known to man or beast, they experienced a deep and profound bliss state, a period of oneness and pure love, total transcendental ego death, and for this reason 5-MeO is often called the God particle. It wasn't quite like that for me. No, I'd say it was more like the single most intense experience of absolute, unadulterated, pure, raw emotional pain imaginable. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, 15. Impossible to say, really. Time, space, here, there, up, down, now, then, me, all had become rather vague. I was adrift in an eternity of darkness, at the heart of which throbbed a formless mass of incredible density, and a voice was saying, "This is your pain. This is your pain. It has always been here. It will always be here. Some is yours, and some is others. It is not to be cured nor avoided. There is no shame. It does not make you weak, nor less than. This is what is at the heart of all men. You are fragile, you are sensitive, you are vulnerable. These are not the traits that belong to the feminine. These are the qualities men have denied.
Yeah, that's probably
Good.
about the place to leave off there.
That was, yeah. I mean, that was, you know, you were talking earlier about being in that feminine space, and we do ascribe gender to these different qualities within human experience, and that was very profound for me to be taught by this intelligence. These are not feminine traits, you know, to be vulnerable, to be sensitive, to that's not feminine. That's what these are, masculine qualities. And I didn't quite articulate it there. Maybe I wrote about it later, or maybe I thought it, I can't remember. But I know that my experience at the time was that I was being showed that the kind of masculinity that my father modeled for me is just one version of many versions of masculinity. And that kind of John Wayne, old school John Wayne stereotype isn't all that there is to being a man. And in fact, being fragile is as masculine as being tough. It's just we don't value it in that way. And I think if we can, I think it's fantastic you've been, involved in that work as long as you have. And I think the more men we can encourage to accept and explore their fragility, that, because fragility doesn't mean weak or pathetic, it means delicate, and I think there's an incredible tenderness that I experience in men, that has real fragility and delicacy, like a flower or a butterfly. But we don't call those things weak or pathetic just because a flower has delicacy or fragility. We respect that. And if we can do that to each other, both men and women, I think that would make a profound difference to how we interact.
Somewhat synchronistically, I was listening this morning to an interview with Alan Cumming, the actor. I assume you know him.
I don't think I do.
Some? No?
No.
No. Oh, well, he's written I guess a couple of memoirs, and the most recent one, he gets into talking about his difficulties with his father, who was cruel.
Right.
And probably some version of insane, really did very cruel things, as well as being very belittling and so on. And as well as telling him for years that he was not his biological son, when finally Cumming had a DNA test and confronted him with, I am your biological son. Mm-hmm. And Cumming struggling with his sexuality and getting married for a number of years. And then for 8 years, he was married. And then more recently, he's been 17 years in a partnership with a man. Your sexuality you go to in the book, and maybe that was some of the most difficult part for you to write and to kind of put out there to the world. And if I can drag you through a little bit of that again here, because you were seduced by an older woman when you were 17. Mm. And I get the impression that you were kind of a naive 17-year-old. Would that be right?
Yeah. Is there any other option out there?
Yeah, there are probably a lot of very 17-year-olds who have maybe a lot more sexual experience and so on than you did at that time.
Actually, that's one of the things I left out of the book. I thought I'll bring that. I'll save that for another book. Again, primarily partly thinking about my kids, although I'm sure I've told them all of this stuff, but also trying to keep it efficient. I don't think it's necessary to tell everything in a book to make a point. And it was more important to me to make a point than write an autobiography. But I can't actually remember when I first had my first experience of full penetrative sex. It was probably 8 or 9 years old, with a girl who was a year younger than me. And that probably messed me up more than the experiences I had when I was 17. And I would say almost certainly primed me to have those experiences when I was 17. I think that predatory people have and people who've been sexualized prematurely have a kind of vibration that synchronizes. So I think she picked up on the fact that I was already kind of vibrating in that way.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I talked about it, probably in my 30s in therapy, that the therapist went, well, what the fuck was going on for that little girl? Because I was not the only person she was having full sex with. And like I say, she was probably 8 or 9 or maybe 10 years old.
Yeah.
I know for a fact she was quite active. And he was like, so, I mean, that kid must have been involved in some kind of abuse story, which, you know, I hadn't considered, but I just knew that it had really messed me up. And it really taught me that, you know, sex when you're a kid is something that people just aren't psychologically equipped to deal with.
The story that that little girl may have turned into the sort of woman that you encountered at 17, who was an older woman,
maybe,
you know, which has been glorified in the movie, you know, Mrs.
Robinson, yeah.
Mrs. Robinson, yeah, kind of glorified there. And lots of adolescent males have the fantasy of an older woman and how wonderful and exciting that would be. But you actually came to see your experience as sexual abuse, that you were being victimized and even being raped.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I wondered more recently, perhaps, as it became, you know, it took me a long time to process it. And this book was part of me. I guess I'm sharing that processing publicly. But I guess I was curious why I was particularly attracting sexual abuse cases in my work. You could say, well, that's just a cross section of society. You put 10 people in a room and at least 5 or 6 are going to be abused. But I also noticed I was good at it, and I just had a kind of affinity for it somehow. And it makes more sense now that I realized I was resonating. And, you know, they say in the therapy world, you get the clients you need. So I think these guys just kept showing up until I finally went, oh, I think maybe I should look at my own history here. But it wasn't until, again, my early 50s, I talked about it in therapy. And I think in such a way that it wasn't picked up on. But in my early 50s, I talked about it again in a men's group that I'm in as a participant. And I think I talked about it quite dismissively. And the therapist said, but that's rape. And I was like, well, it's not rape. I mean, I was a guy, you know, it's not rape. A woman can't rape a guy. Or words to that effect. And he went, so if you flip the genders, and if you've got a 17-year-old girl who's shaking with fear and saying, no, I don't want this, and a 45-year-old man climbs on top of her and has sex with her, even though she's saying no, how would you describe that? And I was like, well, that's rape. And he was like, so why is it rape if it's a woman, but not if it's a man? And that's still something that I struggle with. I really struggle to use that word. I feel like I'm exaggerating or I'm making a fun, you know, the stuff that I know is very common for people who've been abused. They think, you know, oh, this, I'm making a big deal, but other people have had it worse. So it's one of the coping mechanisms is to minimize. So I still find that very difficult. But that wasn't the hard stuff for me in writing the book. The hardest stuff was looking at that question. So are all abusers, you know, have they been abused? And is that a kind of, you know, inevitable progression that when you've been abused, you become an abuser? That was the really dark, scary stuff for me. And to ask those questions. So in which way have I been transgressive? And looking into those shadier corners, I found that, I found that very painful and scary, and ultimately relieving, because I think I can put my hand on my heart and say I have no sexual feelings towards children, even to the, you know, in things that may seem silly to some people, but this whole culture of the pressure that I know a lot of women feel to, you know, shave their genitals, that's really not my thing. That freaks me out, because I don't want to have sex with someone who's shaved their genitals because it looks like a little girl, and that's freaky for me.
How old are your kids, by the way? You have boys?
No, I got fucking loads of kids because everyone's got loads of kids nowadays. I've got two biological kids, two daughters who are 16 and no 17 and 19. So they're young women now. And I have a 13-year-old stepson and a 16-year-old stepdaughter and an 18-year-old stepson.
Wow.
So
So
yeah.
fatherhood is another thing we can talk about. And the you dedicate your book to Trúc Mai. Am I saying that properly?
Yeah. Yeah, that's my partner. She's French Vietnamese.
Yeah, French Vietnamese, and so she's kind of uh, she pops up every now and then in the book, and so maybe I was wondering about her and wondering if she's still in your life.
Mm.
Do you two live together?
No, no, she lives in Paris. I live in London, and we're currently banned from seeing each other, which, over the last 2 years, it's been quite problematic, and we've gone
Well,
for not as I know some people have been separated for like 18 months. We've managed to get across the border, and we are actually booked to get married on January the 7th, but we're not allowed to be together. So whether that and this is not very romantic. One of the reasons, I mean, we love each other and we're committed in a committed relationship, but one of the things that's perhaps speeded that up is if you're married, then your relationship's recognized and you can travel across the borders, whereas an unmarried couple can't. So we were like,
huh?
okay, let's get married while this thing's quiet, and then of course it's all
Yeah.
blown up. So I don't think I'll
Which
be able to do
country's
that.
rule is that? Is that the UK or France?
Both, because
Both.
it's tit for tat. You're talking about at least 1,000 years of hostility between the two countries, and yeah, the minute the French introduce a rule, the British, will do the same, and vice versa. So it's bad news that Brexit and COVID coincided, because I think there's a lot of bitter feeling between,
Yeah.
I'm on the side of the French. I think that they feel bitter at this whole Brexit thing is totally
Yeah.
understandable. So I think they
Yeah.
behave in a more punitive way around this because of that. And I don't really blame
Uh-huh.
them.
By the way, I probably should ask you, do you have something coming up, a men's therapy session or something that I should
Nope.
be concerned about time?
Nope, I'm off work till mid-January now, so we can talk till then if you want.
I don't think I would hold out quite that long, at least not on Zoom. Um, your relationship to drugs over the course of your life certainly is very interesting, because in the first 30 or so years of your life, it sounds like you dosed yourself with just about everything that was out there. Uh, what do you think about that briefly? What was that about, rather?
I mean, that was definitely. I think there were multiple things. It's that I suppose it's easy to say it became self-medication, it became pain management, but also it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun, and it was a lot of fun back then because it was so illegal. Now you walk down my corridor and the whole place stinks of weed.
Yeah.
London stinks of weed. Everywhere you go, it stinks of weed.
Huh.
But I really liked being part of a subculture, and as a dyslexic, autistic, whatever I am, um, an outsider, who failed miserably at school, and was drawn to Kerouac and these kind of things. To be part of a subculture had a genuine romance for me. I loved it. I loved
Yeah.
scoring drugs. I loved being part of a kind of that, that you understood each other. If you dropped acid, it was still a very kind of, a rare thing in those
Right.
days compared
Yep.
with now. I mean,
Yep. Yep.
if you smoked dope, if you took amphetamines, and it was part of the lifestyle of being a musician. And for the first few years, it was a huge amount of fun, and I don't have any regrets about that at all. I think the reason I quit in the end was primarily because it wasn't fun. It's like, this has become boring, and I would rather find new challenges, because there was that kind of seeker part of me perhaps in a kind of naive, Jim Morrison kind of way of wanting to open some doors of perception. And actually, by the end, I found it was just closing. It was closing doors. Nothing was opening.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It could get to be very repetitive.
Mm.
So you write that for a period you got lost. That I like the phrase that you lost the plot. You say, and in your 40s, and went into drug rehab. And I'm wondering what the drug rehab was like for you, because sounds like it was probably a big shift away from the lifestyle that you had lived up to that point. Was it a 12-step program? Was it about total abstinence?
I did 12-step for about 6 months. The hardest thing for me, I found kicking drugs easy because, like I say, it was boring. And I like challenges. And so I found that working on myself and living with my pain became the new high in a way. And the challenge of knowing myself more profoundly. But the hardest thing for me was leaving the subculture, leaving the scene. And I knew I had to, I left my girlfriend, I left my job. I was working in the film business, which was a very, very druggy scene in the 80s. I left all my friends. I left my home. I just walked away with a trash bag full of, odds and ends and clothes and started a new life. So I have done that throughout my life. I have a tendency to just burn everything to the ground and then start again. But I really missed. I missed being part of something that felt glamorous. One of the guys I talked to in the book, a friend of mine called Tim Page, he was a Vietnam War photographer, and he talks about the excitement of war. And he says it almost apologetically, like, I'm sorry, but it was fun. And it was really exciting. And I feel the same way about drug culture. It was fun. It was exciting. It exposed me to adventures and people that I really, really, I'm glad I had those experiences, and I'm glad I stopped, because you keep chasing that high after a while. But I don't have any regrets about doing that. I think I probably went too far into trying to be straight and conventional and acceptable. And I had, my 40s and my early 50s have really been about integrating, becoming more of a whole person. So the kind of to behave responsibly and ethically in myself, whilst also holding on to a bit of an edge and having a fuck off doormat and the accoutrements of a rock and roll, which are kind of that's you're not supposed to do that if you're a professional psychotherapist,
right?
Seems to work for my client base. So
yeah. I recently have wondered if during the period where I was interested, sort of experimenting with psychedelics in graduate school, and I wonder about the relationships, that there was that feeling that you're talking about of being part of an in-group, and and breaking the law and all of that. Sort of, we're part of a special crowd here. We're in the know, and so in the process, you cut out other people who you perceive as squares. And so now I kind of wonder what relationships that I miss with the squares that actually might have been very important. And
my practice is really, I feel very blessed, because my practice means that I've formed very, very, I tend to, in my life in general, I tend to do long-term relationships, and that's true of my practice. So there's people I've worked with for over 20 years, and there's definitely quite a few that if I met them at a party or in a bar or whatever, I wouldn't, my own prejudice or my kind of snobbishness or sense of who I am and who they are would have meant that I would have probably excluded them. And I've got to know them very, very well. And they're fascinating, wonderful people that it would have been my loss if I decided they weren't hip enough for me to hang out with. And actually, a lot of the people, just to contradict what I said earlier, a lot of the people that I did take drugs with were really, really boring, because that's all we had in common. So once
Yes.
you took the
Yeah.
drugs out of it, So I think you're right there. Everyone's fascinating if you take the time to really get inside.
Yeah. Everybody's got a story, and
Mm.
that's really one of the things that we learn. So you kind of came full circle from that one kind of drug involvement to then getting involved with plant medicines, the psychedelics. And somehow that was a different version of the journey, I guess, because it involved more self-confrontation.
Yeah. If you, do you know Joseph Campbell?
Oh, yeah.
He talks about this, and a lot of Jungian therapists will talk about this, that in the Grail quest, the young Parsifal, the young knight, will get a glimpse of the Grail when they're young, but they're not mature enough to really get the full benefit of that. So they have to go out and quest for another 20 or 30 years. And then when they reach a certain maturity, the Grail will be revealed to them. And I like that motif. I like that image a lot, because when I was young and I was playing around with psychedelics, I was playing around with everything, but I did quite a lot of psychedelics. And, I remember those kind of moments of going, my God, I understand it all. And then waking up the next morning and going, shit, what was that? And it would slip through my fingers and I would forget, like you
Yes.
forget a dream. And so when I came back to, I hadn't used any psychedelics for probably almost 25 years. I'd been clean for over 20 years. And when I came back and went, and I think the first thing I did was I drank ayahuasca.
That's coming back with a vengeance.
Yeah, that's really.
I have not done ayahuasca, but I've read about it, heard stories, etc.
Yeah, no, it's there's it's this phrase, the psychedelic renaissance, is something I'm hearing more and more, and I think that's on the whole, that's a good thing, with some some caution around how it's administered and where you do it, and that kind of whole setting thing still stands up. But yeah, I think when I came back in my 50s and approached it in a more respectful way, I think maybe it was Michael Pollan, the journalist, the writer Michael Pollan, I heard him talking recently, and he was saying, where you have ritual and ceremony with mind-altering substances, you rarely have problems, compared with when things are used kind of indiscriminately.
Yeah.
Then people will get into difficulties. And so I think if you approach a lot of things with a certain amount of humility and reverence, they become teachers, they become tools, rather than like in my 20s, it was mostly about escapism, whereas in my 50s it's been the opposite. It's been about confronting myself. And these medicines are that's why I differentiate. I don't call them drugs. Some people would say that's semantics, but drugs for me are about pleasure, they're about escape, or they're about pain relief, whereas plant medicine, there's no escape. It's very confronting, and like it or not, you will be shown yourself, so that can be very tough.
Yeah.
They've all been ordeals. All of them have been ordeals for me. Not horrible experiences, but very challenging, very tough. And I haven't done anything for about 3 years now. I take a long time these days to process and digest what I've been shown.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's not an addictive thing.
Is there anything that we've not talked about here that you want to make sure that we touch on?
We haven't. It's interesting, actually. I've done a lot of podcasts. The part of the book that very few people talk about is part 3, is the rock and roll part, which is that's the truest part of the book, in terms of that's the bit of the book. It ended up at the end. That's the bit of the book that I started out, that I thought the whole book was going to be about. That seems to grab people less in these interviews. And I don't know if that's because it's less interesting, or everyone wants to talk about plant medicine, because
right.
it's of the moment. And I think that's fair enough. And everyone wants to talk about sex.
Tell
always,
us about the rock and roll and what was there for you. I don't It's funny. It's been a while since I read the book. This interview actually got postponed, and and my brain doesn't retain it all. So I've probably forgotten a lot of it. I have the sense that as the book went on, though, it got a bit preachy with some of your pet themes of what's wrong with the world. And so I don't remember the quotes rock and roll part.
Yeah. No, that's
even though that I think that happened around the last third of the book.
Yeah, that's my soapbox bit. I suppose I was weaving some stuff around misogyny and climate change into the mix there. And also, there was some stuff around war and like I said earlier, I think a lot of the men's movement did actually come out of, veterans groups. So I'm interested in that and how, as men, I think we have got a long history of forming packs. So I kind of made a perhaps somewhat tenuous argument that a rock and roll band has its origins in a kind of hunting pack, and that it's just a modern day version of male bonding. And that was very true for me. And I still play music with the same people I played with 40 years ago, and we play together. We have fantastic chemistry when we play music together, but we don't hang out in between. I think we only really know how to hang out when we play music because we have a function, we have a role, and as men we don't know how else to do that. And so I was exploring some of that and just looking at this natural, for me, what is a natural state for men to get together and perhaps to do stuff together. I mean, that's certainly true.
Yeah. What's your instrument?
I'm a guitar player.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can just imagine how wonderful that is. I've been a folk guitar player, but never got terribly advanced. But some of the most transcendent experiences of my life have been making music in a small group with other people. And
there's a kind of meditation that happens because you've got 4, 5, 6, however many people that make a noise that only 4 or 5 people can make, and that's what I love about my men's groups is something happens, when you put a bunch of people together, and especially the more you do it. Like I said, I do long-term relationships, so 40-year relationships with my musician friends, 20-something year relationships with the guys in my men's group. It starts to really cook up. And I made a film with my partner. She's a filmmaker, and we made a film which is kind of part 3 of the book, the story of us walking through the First World War battlefields. And we made a film, and that I say to people, say, so how long did the film take to make? And I say, well, actually about 3 days of shooting and then a few months of editing, but it was 25 years of kind of pre-production, because it took that long for me to work with these guys, for them to be willing to go on camera and be as, you reference the kind of intimacy of the book. And I think that's very present in the film that we made, because what you're seeing on camera is the intimacy of a bunch of guys who have really been through some shit together, and that's why we went to the battlefields, because I think there's a kind of resonance there of people going through struggles. And we us guys who haven't had a war to go and prove ourselves in, we've been dealing with our internal wars as opposed to our grandparents who went through the.
I had forgotten about that section of walking through the battlefields. So that brings it back. Is that film available anywhere where we could see it?
Yeah, I'll send you a link personally, and there's a
good.
website where people can access it, which is I'll send you the details. You can link that in your show notes or something. But the film's called "Make Me a Man," which is a line from one of the First World War poems, and so it's makemeaman.com.
Wonderful. Well, I feel about ready to wrap it up, I think, for now.
Yeah.
Although it would be wonderful to hang out with you in person and just ramble and see what comes up.
Well, I've never
but
been to California. If I ever make it to California, I'll give you a shout out.
do so. Northern California.
Okay.
California is a very long state.
Yeah.
and Southern California and Northern California and Central California, those probably the state politically and so on. It could be 3 different states, 3 different countries. Hey, Jerry, I really appreciate this opportunity to spend time with you and to have, I'm walking on the word, to have virtually shared some of the journey vicariously is the word I was looking for, to vicariously.
Well, thank you.
Been able to enjoy your journey. And so thanks for being with me today on Shrink Wrap Radio. And if you use that name,
yeah,